morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for all the attendees for this session as part of the SOCRA Annual Conference. My name is Deepak Gandotra, and in today's session, we are talking about how do we accelerate trial recruitment, the observations, the recommendations during post COVID-19 pandemic. So let's get started. Before we go into the core lessons that we have learned, the examples that we have, let me take a minute giving you a background about myself. As I said, my name is Deepak Gandotra. I'm Senior Director at Indegene. We are a technology-led healthcare provider and combining deep industry expertise, fit-for-purpose technology in an agile and scalable operating model. A bit about myself, I've been in the healthcare space since the last 12 years. I'm based in Bangalore, India, working with sponsors across the globe, sites, CROs, and other stakeholders. So moving on, these are the core topics we'll be covering. We will, of course, talk about the recruitment trends during and post the peak of COVID-19. The core section of today's discussion will be focused on Indegene's experience, the project that we have worked on with our clients, typically clinical trial sponsors, what we have learned from that experience, and then most important, what recommendations we have for all of you who are part of this session today to take away when you are thinking of applying digital tools for accelerating clinical trial recruitment for your studies. And finally, we'll have any questions. So with that, let's get started. Before we go into the case examples, I wanted to take a minute or to talk about what our research tells us. As part of our consulting arm, we have been tracking the site experience from February 2021. The chart that you are seeing on the right hand side tells us that 57% of respondents reported that they have used or planning to use a digital tool. This was February 2021. And as you can see, this number has significantly improved over the last year and a half, and 81% is what was reported in the February edition of earlier this year. I think we are not surprised. We all expected that digital adoption would increase. But what is interesting is this adoption has been across the board. Among the respondents who have said that they have used or planning to use, the breakdown of those numbers on the extreme right hand side. What is interesting is patient-facing interventions as well as clinical trial operations, which are probably not directly related to patients. We have seen a significant improvement across the board when it comes to how digital has been leveraged for recruitment. And feel free to get in touch or search about Indegene or DT Consulting Clinical Trial Digital Tracker. There are a lot of more insights from clinical trial site perspective and from other stakeholders perspective, talking about patient adherence, patient retention, and so on. Moving on, the reason I wanted to talk about this before we go into the case example is many times it's important to also understand the framework in which we would like to design our clinical trial. So what you are seeing at the top, we have patient recruitment and patient enrollment. And once the patients are part of the clinical trial, how do we improve retention and adherence? But then there are multiple use cases or touch points which are at the spokes, whether those are recruitment channels, end-to-end platforms, e-consenting. Almost all of us have been touched by telemedicine, for example, the virtual consultation part. And then there are certain nuances on the regulatory aspect, depending on which country we are part of, what is allowed or not allowed from a local regulatory aspect on e-consenting patient communication. But this is the front end design or the framework when we are looking at how do we engage patients as part of either clinical research team or sites or sponsors. But then equally important, if not more, are the behind the scene capabilities. which you see as the horizontal bar at the bottom, and aspects such as creating the right content which appeals to the patients in an empathetic manner, helps improve the awareness of the clinical trial, improving the relationship of the investigator and patients. Real world data, real world analytics, the importance cannot be overstated. These are all drivers or enablers when we are thinking of designing the right framework for digital intervention in patient recruitment. So it's important for us to take a step back, understand what are going to be the enablers, and what are going to be the key channels as part of a particular clinical trial or a portfolio, as we are thinking of working on traditional and digital channels for recruitment. With that, let me go to some examples. We have three examples for you, actually two which were part of the trial recruitment, and then we added a wildcard case example which was emphasizing the clinical trial design part. I'll go through those examples in detail, talking about what has worked on the digital channel activation part. We have also experienced the nurse concierge being an enabler during the peak of COVID pandemic, and especially for certain therapy area. To talk about that, and then again emphasizing on the importance of clinical trial design as part of the third example, and then we look at the larger picture from our broader experience. So this example that you are seeing right now on the screen is for COVID-19 clinical trial. I can share the details of the sponsor, and the details. You can also see the testimonial that we got from the sponsor. But in order to lay down the broad context of what was happening, and how we got involved in this and what was deployed, this was for a COVID-19 drug in order to prevent cytokine storm. And as most of you are aware, cytokine storm is unfortunately the biggest driver that leads to fatalities during COVID-19. That is when it leads to lung failure, multiple organ failure, and so on. So the organization had a molecule called lenzilumab. They wanted to try this while this was being tried for oncology, wanted to explore the utility of this from a clinical trial perspective in COVID-19. During the phase 3 clinical trial, while they were having the discussions with the regulatory, they had to increase the patient count from 300 patients to 520 patients. And it was a tall order. We had short span of time, and that is where we got involved into this study. And just to provide more context, this was also around the time when US elections were being conducted. So there were some constraints and challenges around going digital and deploying those digital campaigns to reach out to patients and other stakeholders. So in order to activate this and following a multi-pronged approach, I'm not sure if it is very clearly visible, but on the right hand side, the three images that you are able to see are the example outreach collateral that we ran in English and Spanish. The reason for running this in multiple languages was to be able to reach out to a more diverse population. For example, Hispanic population might be more comfortable with Spanish language. And as you can see from the heat map, the geography or the sites were well distributed across the US. In order to do an efficient deployment of digital channels, we realize it's important that we run it in a hyper-local manner rather than going all out from an ROI perspective. And that is what we did for patient campaign. But at the same time, what we also realized is, because we are talking about patients who are having serious condition, they are admitted in hospital, and hence the prevention of cytokine storm, it will also be important for us to reach out to other stakeholders, doctors in this case. So doctors who are in the vicinity of these clinical research sites, who are potentially treating COVID-19 patients, who are currently having serious condition, it is important for us to educate them, reach out to them, and tell them about other possibilities. As all of us were scrambling and trying to learn what are the various possibilities, it's important that the communication is clear. The call to action, which is on the digital posters that we are putting across on multiple platforms, is very clear, and they have a support system in order to reach out both from a HCP perspective as well as from a patient perspective. So keeping these aspects in mind, we deployed our digital campaign on Google Search, Google Display, Facebook, Instagram, and other online and social media channels. With our AI ML based algorithm, we were also able to slice and dice the data, understand where the campaign is showing better results, faster deployment, ROI was being tracked on a regular basis. The core idea is to be able to reach out to relevant patient population as early as possible and provide this option to them as a potential clinical trial participant. The outcomes, which are part of the pink box that you are seeing on the top right, we were able to deploy that. Because these are digital channels, the deployment was done at a very rapid pace. We saw 17,000 weekly unique visits, a good qualification rate of 7% as compared to what we have seen in the industry and other therapy areas. And we were able to qualify 460 participants for the next stage of qualification. Overall, we were able to help our client, the sponsor of this clinical trial, complete this target in about 2.5 months, which is very rapid. And when you compare this with traditional digital channels, we were all very pleased with the results, especially given this is COVID-19. There's so much anxiety, uncertainty in the system. So this is an example that I wanted to present to you today from a digital channel activation perspective. Another example, around the same time, this was also active during the peak of pandemic. Actually, this was for a Japanese client, and the quick context is that they ran this clinical trial in Japan and other countries. They had the regulatory approval in those areas, but in order to complete this trial in the United States, they were facing challenges. The clinical trial was getting extended, the timelines were getting extended. They had various means to do the primary basic qualification of the patients with the help of the CRO, local efforts, and digital efforts. But the health of the funnel, so to speak, was not as optimized. And when we got engaged in these discussions, what we realized is that there are aspects where having a human interface, a human touch in the form of nurse concierge, basically having registered nurses who are trained with the SOPs at the client's end, at our end, and those nurses are having the ability to have a very educated discussion with these patients. There were questions around what happens to the current standard of care, what happens to the existing treatment or treatment provider, how can they be part of this clinical trial, what happens after this clinical trial gets over. Many of these questions got addressed in a very human oriented manner when we deployed the nurse concierge for this study. And the funnel that you are seeing on the bottom right talks about the journey of these potential participants from primary qualification to the calls that were completed by these nurses following with the qualified patients. The reason why we feel that this kind of probably around the clock global virtual nurse concierge could be very useful, not just in this therapy area, which is lumbar disc herniation, by the way, but then also very importantly in therapy areas like oncology or rare diseases, where the patients and the caregivers are already going through a lot of emotional and financial turmoil. And we believe that what we have seen in the past is deploying this kind of nurse concierge setup and having the ability to integrate that with the pre and the post of the nurse concierge qualification has given very strong results from a recruitment perspective. So in this project, we were able to integrate the digital screening efforts with the nurse concierge. So as soon as a patient is getting qualified by local efforts, digital screening, any other channel, the nurse concierge at our end is getting notified. Our SOPs were designed in a way that on an average, the patients will get a call back within 30 minutes of their working day, and they are able to have that discussion, either qualify or disqualify that patient depending on the detailed inclusion exclusion criteria of the clinical trial, and then finally hand over those patients to the site. Another innovation in this space that we have been working on is how do we automatically hand over these patients to the site rather than having a lot of back and forth, and that also is an area of active interest. We have seen a lot of success because we don't want to be in a situation where the patient has qualified, but because of calendaring issues, coordination issues, the handover between the qualification team and the site team should be absolutely seamless. So that's phase two of this that we have been working on and have been seeing very positive results. But coming back to this study, the results that you are seeing on the top right in the pink box, we saw 16% conversion rate, 2,500 primary screening qualified patients, and overall 400 plus secondary qualified patients. And we were able to successfully complete this trial recruitment for the sponsor earlier this year in February. A successful outcome by the integration of nurse concierge. I'll take a quick minute talking about what we have learned from this exercise. While digital channels are so important, what we have seen is currently in the days of Amazon kind of quick experience in e-commerce and other industries, patients are no different, and healthcare as an industry is no different. So the expectations that patients have is they would like an immediate callback or an immediate communication, and what we saw is, as part of our SOPs, if patients are getting a call back within 30 minutes or less, the probability of losing them to follow up, the loss to follow up metric, was significantly lower as compared to a delayed callback. So patients do appreciate instant gratification. That's why we wanted to call out this. The analytics at our end very closely mimic with this kind of trend, which is from earlier research done at Kellogg. But just wanted to call out this part that the combination of digital channel with human touch or without human touch, as the case maybe, or the therapy area, the inclusion exclusion criteria. But these are some of the very important metrics to watch out for when we are thinking of patient recruitment. Okay, as promised, the third case example that we have included in this discussion is not exactly patient recruitment, but it's a very important pre-step to patient recruitment. The reason I've included this is site selection, or rather data-driven site selection, is a very underappreciated attribute currently in the industry. We wanted to call this out because the success, or no, rather the probability of success of patient recruitment in our experience is significantly higher if we are able to have a data-driven, intelligent way of selecting sites, rather than saying, you know, A knows B and C knows D, and hence as part of the network, hence we should use it. So coming back to this example, there were challenges. Our client, an oncology-based biotech organization based in the US and Europe, they were facing uncertainty regarding clinical trial protocol and recruitment timelines because they were facing competition from large pharma organizations in the non-small cell lung cancer space. There were delays in the feasibility identification and the outreach and the two-way communication between the sponsor team and the research sites. So we had a root cause analysis, consultative discussion with the sponsor. What we realized is that we should have a data-driven approach and have an exhaustive, comprehensive approach in order to present what are the possible sites. And we created a self-serve dashboard for the sponsor where they were able to rank order sites by geography based on customized parameters. For example, how many clinical trials for non-small cell lung cancer are being run at site A versus B versus C? On an average, how many past relevant clinical trials in the non-small cell lung cancer space has that particular clinical trial site and their associated PIs have ran, and how many of those clinical trials are currently active, which is an indicator of competition at that research center. So these are some of our standard important metrics that should be considered when selecting clinical trial sites. But then there are also some customized metrics that we created for the sponsor in this case. For example, whether they would prefer to work with a large hospital or the small hospital. Of course, both it has its pros and cons, but it's important to know what our strategy is. Community oncology is a very important aspect, particularly in the US, because everybody keeps going to the top 10, let's say, oncology centers, and community oncology as a setup or the cohort sometimes gets left out from a clinical trial aspect. So all in all, this self-serve dashboard was able to slice and dice that data by sorting and ranking it based on the standard core performance indicators as well as the customized indicators that we agreed upon in collaboration with our sponsor in this case. And then we were able to also suggest some updates or recommended some changes to the protocol, which were well received by the sponsor. We were able to identify 3 additional regions and countries over and above what the sponsor was planning to do in consultation with the CRO. And we were able to identify 2,000 potential patients as part of our live EMR integration. A lot of them are part of the community oncology setup. So those patients were typically shadowed or were not part of the core patient cohort set. So with that, I would move to the next section of what our recommendations are. And this is, I think, something which is relevant for all of you who are listening into this session. Doesn't matter which therapy area, region, or geography you're part of. So I'll now go to the next section and talk about what our recommendations are for all of you based on what we have experienced during and now that the pandemic is subsiding. Okay, so before we go into the recommendations from a recruitment point of view, just wanted to call out some of the leading indicators which could help us influence the outcome of the clinical trial. We have spoken about the protocol review part in the last case example. Recruitment forecasting is also a very important step that tells us the planned versus actual of any particular clinical trial or portfolio of clinical trials. We spoke about having a data driven way of selecting sites rather than just going by anecdotal examples or our network. And then finally, if possible, have a voice of site view through market research, through other means, to be able to understand and appreciate what concerns, what feedback are coming from the sites, because sites as a stakeholder is so much important across clinical trials and also in case of hybrid clinical trials, not just for the traditional setup of clinical trials. So with this, I'll go into the details of the site approach part, and then we will talk about some of the recommendations in the recruitment space. Having a data-driven approach to site and region selection, of course, is enabled by a comprehensive repository of global sites, the understanding of having the right KPIs, the ability to be able to fetch and deliver real-time site-level information, and of course, it helps us eliminate the guesswork into the equation of which site would perform, what percentage of sites would perform, and so on. And finally, the ability to have an enterprise grade database with a flexible, customized approach that takes care of standard KPIs as well as curated KPIs. And then, of course, the business benefits to this approach are the ability to identify the patients faster, because you are selecting the sites that have higher probability of activation, recruitment success, and closure. And then better trial site analytics, which positions us strongly for the long run of that clinical trial, the next phase of that trial, and the portfolio. So, in the end, what we have discussed so far today, our recommendation from a recruitment perspective are fivefold. We have to start early. We should know the patient. We need to measure. Can't emphasize on that aspect more. Take site into confidence. They are a key stakeholder and provide holistic patient experience. So do not wait to deploy digital channels after the CRO-led or traditional channels have slowed down or are showing signs of not working as per expectation. The ability or the advantage of digital channels is that they can work in a very complementary manner to the traditional channels. So please plan early, please start early. Understanding the patient, the psychology, the emotions, the anxiety of patients is so much important, especially in studies where there is limited patient population, where identifying the patient cohort is a challenge. So please spend more time understanding the trial participant journey, the emotions, and the treatment journey that they would otherwise go through. And I'm very confident that will give you very strong insights on how do you want to reach out to these patients, what messaging we want to take to them, and when do we want to talk to them. Measure always. The strongest differentiator for digital activation, and the ability to be able to track the KPIs in real time across stakeholders, not just from an ROI perspective, but also from a satisfaction perspective. And you would see that the ability to improve and enhance the experience of the clinical trial study across stakeholders is something that becomes possible when we start measuring these KPIs. We've spoken about some of the market research responses from sites earlier on in our discussion today, but taking sites into confidence in terms of whatever digital tools we might be implementing, whether they are patient facing or not, is so much important. Just having the feeling that they are part of the process, they have a seat on the table in terms of decision making. All of these are very important aspects, and as sponsors, as CROs, sometimes these things get overlooked. We believe that from a patient handover perspective, to ensure a minimized loss to follow up, sites are one of a very important stakeholder. And finally, a holistic patient experience during, before, and after the recruitment, instead of having channels operating in silo. If we are able to start early, we are also able to appreciate designing channels which talk to each other, which work in close coherence. For example, enrollment, going into randomization, going into patient communication about their next site visit, and it will help us deliver an outstanding patient experience. So that's all from my side. Before I close, I would like to invite all of you to sign up for an upcoming summit by Indegene. It's 22nd, 23rd September. More insights around clinical trial and many other sessions. And with that, I would look forward to any questions that you might have. So thank you very much for listening into my thoughts today, and happy to take any questions.